Look, I'm not saying I handled things perfectly, but when you work 12-hour shifts surrounded by adrenaline and gorgeous doctors who actually understand your world, shit gets complicated. My boyfriend thought dating a nurse meant he'd have some sweet, caring angel. He had no clue what he was signing up for. I'm Anna, I'm 28, and I work at one of the busiest hospitals in the city. I met my boyfriend David through a mutual friend about 8 months ago. He works in some logistics company. Honestly, I never really paid attention to the details because it sounded mind-numbingly boring compared to what I deal with every day. You know, those people who clock out at 5 and their biggest concern is what to watch on Netflix. That's David. Sweet guy. Don't get me wrong, but God, the man has no idea what real pressure looks like. Those first few months were nice enough. He'd pick me up after my shifts. We'd grab dinner somewhere quiet. Spend lazy Sundays in bed. But here's the thing. When you're literally saving lives and dealing with blood, chaos, and split-second decisions that determine whether someone goes home to their family or not, coming home to someone who gets stressed about his fantasy football lineup starts to feel limiting. David would always ask about my day, but in this surface-level way that showed he didn't really get it. How was work, babe? Like, how do you explain that you held someone's hand while they died? Then, 30 minutes later, you're cracking jokes with your coworkers because that's how you cope. He'd nod and make sympathetic sounds. But I could see his eyes glaze over when I talked about the real stuff. And honestly, I started needing him to be there for me more than he was capable of. When I'd come home emotionally drained, I needed someone who understood that sometimes I just needed to vent for an hour without him trying to fix everything. But David would always jump in with solutions or try to change the subject to something lighter. It was sweet, I guess, but it wasn't what I needed. I'd find myself getting irritated when he'd text me during my shifts asking what I wanted for dinner, or if I wanted to see a movie that weekend. Like, dude, I'm trying to keep people alive over here, and you're worried about meal planning. I started making little jokes about it. Oh, David's having another domestic crisis. I'd say when he'd call about something trivial, the other nurses would laugh, but I could see him flinch sometimes when I did it in front of him. The hospital environment is intense in a way that's hard to explain to outsiders. It's not just the medical stuff. It's the relationships you build with people who understand exactly what you're going through. We've all seen things that would traumatize normal people, and we've learned to process it together. There's this dark humor, this way of finding lightness in the heaviest situations. And it creates bonds that feel deeper than anything you'd find in the regular world. That's where Dr. Cross comes in. He's one of the emergency physicians, probably mid-30s, and he has this way of staying completely calm even when everything's falling apart around him. While other doctors are barking orders and losing their shit during trauma cases, he's this steady presence that somehow makes everyone perform better. And God, he's attractive in that exhausted, slightly dangerous way that only makes sense in a hospital setting. I'd been working with him on and off for about 3 months before I really noticed him noticing me. It started with little things. He'd specifically request me to assist with his more complex cases. He'd remember details about patients I'd mentioned weeks earlier. And he had this way of making eye contact during stressful moments that felt like he was acknowledging that we were both carrying the weight of someone's life. David had no clue about any of this. Obviously, how could he... When I'd come home talking about work, he'd tune out after the first few medical terms. But Dr. Cross understood every reference, every frustration, every small victory. When I told him about losing a patient despite doing everything right, he didn't try to cheer me up or tell me it wasn't my fault. He just nodded and said, "That one's going to stick with you for a while." Finally, someone who got it. I started looking forward to the shifts where I knew he'd be on duty. I'd put a little more effort into my appearance. Better mascara that wouldn't run. The scrubs that fit me better. Perfume that was subtle but noticeable. When David complimented me on looking nice, I'd make some excuse about having a good day or trying a new routine. The conversations with Dr. Cross started extending beyond work stuff. During slower nights, we'd end up talking about everything. Our families, places we'd traveled, books we'd read. He had this way of listening that made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. When I'd tell him about my relationship frustrations, he wouldn't offer advice or try to defend David. He'd just listen and ask thoughtful questions that made me think deeper about what I really wanted. I started comparing them constantly in my head. David would come home from his predictable job and want to hear about my day, but he'd get uncomfortable when I shared anything too intense. Dr. Cross lived in that intensity with me. David would suggest we go to chain restaurants because they were convenient and affordable. Dr. Cross would mention obscure little places he'd discovered, places that felt sophisticated and adult. when David would text me during my breaks, asking if I was okay or if I needed him to pick up anything on his way home. It started feeling suffocating rather than sweet. I'd show the messages to my coworker friends, rolling my eyes like, look how clingy he's being. But when Dr. Cross would ask how I was doing, it felt like genuine interest in my well-being rather than anxious checking up on me. The shift in my feelings was gradual. But looking back, I can see exactly when it started. David and I were having dinner at this Italian place he loved, and he was telling me about some project at work. I was nodding and making the right sounds. But honestly, I was thinking about this complicated case Dr. Cross and I had worked on earlier that week. The patient had come in basically dead. And through this incredible teamwork between the two of us, we'd managed to stabilize him long enough to get him to surgery. The rush of that kind of collaboration, the way we'd communicated almost telepathically during the most critical moments, it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And there I was, sitting across from David while he talked about spreadsheets and delivery schedules. And I realized I felt more connected to Dr. Cross after one intense shift than I did to my boyfriend after 8 months of dating. That's when I knew things were about to get complicated. The first time Dr. Cross and I went for drinks after work, I told myself it was completely innocent. A group of us had finished this particularly brutal shift. We'd lost 2 patients despite everyone's best efforts, and the whole team was emotionally wrung out. Someone suggested hitting the bar down the street from the hospital, and before I knew it, I was sitting in a dimly lit booth with 5 other medical staff, trying to decompress from the day. Most of the group left after an hour or so. They had families to get home to, early shifts the next day, the usual responsibilities. But Dr. Cross and I stayed, and suddenly we were alone, and the conversation shifted into territory that felt dangerous and exciting. "You were incredible today," he said, referring to how I'd handled the family of one of the patients we'd lost. "I've seen seasoned nurses fall apart in those situations, but you knew exactly what they needed to hear." The way he was looking at me, like he saw something in me that even I didn't recognize, made my chest feel tight. David had never talked to me like this. With this combination of professional respect and personal admiration, when David complimented me, it was usually about how I looked or how sweet I was. Dr. Cross was seeing my competence, my strength, the parts of me that felt most essential. "I couldn't have handled today without you," I told him, and I meant it. The way you stayed calm when that second patient started coding, it kept me grounded. We ended up talking until the bar was closing, sharing stories about the worst cases we'd seen, the patients we still thought about. The ways this job changes you that people outside medicine never understand. When he walked me to my car, there was this moment where we were standing too close, and I could smell his cologne mixed with the faint hospital smell that never quite washes out of our clothes. "We should do this more often," he said. And something about the way he said it made it clear he wasn't just talking about grabbing drinks with the team. I drove home that night feeling more alive than I had in months. David was already asleep when I got there, and I was grateful because I wasn't ready to come down from the high of that conversation. I lay awake replaying every moment, analyzing every word choice, every lingering glance. The next few weeks, Dr. Cross and I started finding more reasons to spend time together. We'd grab coffee during our breaks, stay late to finish paperwork, even when we could have left it for the next shift, volunteer for the same committees and training sessions. I told myself it was just a friendship, just 2 professionals who worked well together, but I was lying to myself, and I think I knew it even then. David started noticing changes in my behavior, though he didn't know what to make of them. I was more distracted when we were together, checking my phone more often, talking about work in vague terms instead of sharing specific stories like I used to. When he'd ask direct questions about my day, I'd give him surface-level answers and change the subject. "You seem different lately," he said one night while we were watching some show he'd picked, more distant. "I guess, is everything okay?" I felt this flash of irritation. Here I was, dealing with life and death every day, forming these intense professional relationships, growing as a person. And he was worried that I seemed distant because I wasn't giving him my undivided attention every second we were together. "I'm fine," I said, not looking away from the TV. "Work's just been intense lately. Do you want to talk about it?" "Not really. I just want to relax." I could feel him studying my face, probably trying to figure out what had changed. The truth was, I didn't want to talk to him about what was really happening at work because it would involve talking about Dr. Cross, and I wasn't ready to examine why that felt like dangerous territory. Instead, I started picking at little things David did that annoyed me. The way he loaded the dishwasher, how he'd interrupt me when I was trying to tell a story, his habit of leaving his socks on the bedroom floor. Things that had never bothered me before suddenly felt like major character flaws. "You're being kind of critical lately," he said after I'd snapped at him for forgetting to buy the specific brand of coffee I liked. It's like nothing I do is right anymore. I'm not being critical, I shot back. I just don't understand why it's so hard to remember simple things. But even as I said it, I knew I was being unfair. The real issue wasn't the coffee or the socks or any of the other stupid things I'd been getting on his case about. The real issue was that Dr. Cross would have remembered the coffee. Dr. Cross paid attention to details. Dr. Cross made me feel like my preferences mattered. I started staying at work longer, volunteering for extra shifts, finding excuses to be at the hospital when I knew Dr. Cross would be there. When David would ask about my schedule, I'd be vague about the timing, making it sound like these were mandatory overtime situations rather than choices I was making. The first time Dr. Cross and I kissed, it was after an especially difficult case. We'd worked for 3 hours trying to save this kid who'd been in a car accident. And despite everything we did, we lost him. The family's grief was devastating, and both of us were emotionally destroyed. We were in the break room afterward, not talking, just sitting in that heavy silence that follows loss. He reached over and squeezed my hand, and when I looked up at him, there were tears in his eyes that matched mine. I hate this part of the job, he said quietly. Me too. We were sitting close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight he carried from cases like this. And maybe it was the emotional intensity of the moment, or maybe it was all the tension that had been building between us for weeks. But suddenly we were kissing. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was soft, tentative. Like we were both acknowledging something that had been inevitable for a while. When we broke apart, we didn't say anything. We just looked at each other, and I knew everything had changed. I drove home that night in a daze. David was waiting up for me, which he'd started doing more often when I worked late shifts. "How was your day?" he asked, pulling me into a hug. "Long," I said, which wasn't technically a lie, but standing there in his arms. I felt like the worst person in the world because all I could think about was how different it felt when Dr. Cross touched me. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Cross and I started finding ways to be alone together. We'd meet in supply closets between patients, stay behind after team meetings, take our breaks at the same time, and disappear to quiet corners of the hospital. Every stolen moment felt electric and dangerous. I started lying to David more creatively. Work emergencies that required me to stay late, mandatory training sessions that happened to fall on evenings when he'd planned date nights, team building events that didn't actually exist. He believed every story because he trusted me, and his trust made the lying easier and more guilt-inducing at the same time. "I feel like I never see you anymore," he said one night when I came home from what I'd told him was a staff meeting, but had actually been 2 hours in Dr. Cross's car, talking and touching and crossing lines I'd never thought I'd cross. "Oh, I know. I'm sorry. Things should calm down soon." I lied, but they weren't going to calm down. If anything, they were about to get much more complicated. The affair started in earnest about a month after that first kiss. Dr. Cross knew about David. I'd mentioned my relationship early on, back when we were just colleagues who worked well together. But as things intensified between us, the existence of my boyfriend became this elephant in the room that we both chose to ignore. "We should probably talk about this," he said one night when we were in his car after work. My lipstick smeared and my scrubs wrinkled from our makeout session. "What's to talk about?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant. "You're in a relationship. I know, I know." He studied my face in the dim light from the parking lot lamps. "Are you okay with this? The situation, I should have said no. I should have ended it right there, gone home to David, and figured out whether I wanted to fix my relationship or end it honestly. But looking at Dr. Cross, remembering how alive I felt when I was with him, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. "Are you?" I asked instead. He leaned over and kissed me again, which was answer enough. We started meeting outside of work. He'd text me during my days off, and I'd make excuses to David about running errands or meeting girlfriends for lunch. Instead, I'd meet Dr. Cross at coffee shops across town, at restaurants where we were unlikely to run into anyone from the hospital, in his apartment when his schedule allowed. The lies became more elaborate and more frequent. I created an entire fictional social life to explain my absences: book clubs, yoga classes, shopping trips with coworkers David had never met. I got good at remembering which story I'd told when, good at creating believable details that would satisfy his questions without raising suspicions. David, for his part, seemed to accept my explanations without much scrutiny. He trusted me, and he was busy with his own work and his own social commitments. Looking back, I think part of me resented how easy it was to deceive him. Shouldn't he have been more curious? More suspicious? The fact that he believed my lies so readily made me feel like he didn't know me well enough to recognize when I was being dishonest. Dr. Cross and I developed our own secret language at work. Meaningful glances during patient handoffs, coded text messages about supply closet meetings, inside jokes that we'd share in front of the whole team without anyone else understanding the subtext. The secrecy made everything feel more intense, more significant. I started compartmentalizing my life in ways that let me avoid examining what I was doing too closely. When I was with David, I'd focus on his flaws, how predictable he was, how he didn't challenge me intellectually, how our conversations never felt as stimulating as the ones I had with Dr. Cross. When I was with Dr. Cross, I'd focus on the connection we shared, the way he understood my work life, the intellectual and physical chemistry between us. I convinced myself that what David didn't know wouldn't hurt him. Our relationship had been struggling anyway. We'd grown apart. We wanted different things. We weren't as compatible as we'd initially thought. The affair wasn't the cause of our problems. It was just a symptom of deeper incompatibilities that had been there all along. At least, that's what I told myself. The physical relationship with Dr. Cross intensified quickly. We started taking more risks, longer meetings, more intimate encounters, even occasional overnight stays when I could invent believable cover stories. I'd tell David I was working double shifts, staying over at a friend's place after a late night out, attending weekend conferences that required overnight travel, each lie built on the previous ones, creating an increasingly complex web of deception that required constant maintenance. I had to remember which story I'd told about which weekend, which coworker I'd supposedly spent time with, which fictional events I'd attended. My phone became a security risk. I'd delete text threads with Dr. Cross, use private browsing for restaurant reservations, create false calendar entries to support my alibis. The guilt was there. But it was manageable because I'd convinced myself that I was protecting David from unnecessary pain. Why hurt him with information about something that might not even last, say? Why destroy our relationship over what might just be a phase? A temporary lapse in judgment brought on by work stress and circumstance. But even as I rationalized my behavior, I knew I was being selfish. I was having my cake and eating it too, maintaining the stability and comfort of my relationship with David while pursuing the excitement and passion I felt with Dr. Cross. I was making choices for David without his consent, deciding what he could and couldn't handle, what he did and didn't deserve to know. The worst part was how natural it all started to feel. Lying became second nature. Compartmentalization became automatic. And managing two relationships simultaneously became just another skill I'd developed. I was proud of how well I was handling everything, how smoothly I was keeping both parts of my life running without either man being hurt by knowledge of the other. I should have known it couldn't last forever. Secrets like that have a way of surfacing, and lies that complex inevitably start to crumble under their own weight. But I was so caught up in the thrill of it all, so convinced of my own cleverness, that I never seriously considered how it might end. I definitely never imagined it would end with both of us losing our jobs. Asana. The beginning of the end started with something so small, I almost didn't notice it. David and I were having dinner at this diner we used to go to early in our relationship, and he seemed distracted, checking his phone more than usual, giving short answers to my questions. "Everything okay?" I asked, which was ironic since I'd been distracted and secretive for months. "Yeah, just work stuff," he said, but something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. He seemed different, more observant, like he was studying me in a way he hadn't before. When I told him I had to work late the next night, which was actually a planned evening with Dr. Cross, he just nodded, but I caught him watching my face as I spoke. "You've been working a lot of overtime lately?" he said casually. "Hospital's been short-staffed," I replied, which wasn't entirely untrue. "Must be exhausting." "It is, but..." There was something in the way he said it that made me wonder if he was starting to put pieces together. I brushed off the paranoia. I'd been careful. I'd covered my tracks. There was no way he could know anything concrete. Over the next few weeks, though, I started noticing more little things. David would ask specific questions about my schedule that he'd never asked before. He'd mention running into mutual friends who'd ask about me, friends I'd supposedly spent time with but actually hadn't seen in months. He'd bring up details from stories I'd told him about work. Details that didn't quite match other things I'd said. I started getting sloppy, too. The mental energy required to maintain all those lies was exhausting, and I was making small mistakes. Forgetting which version of a story I'd told, contradicting myself about timing, losing track of which fictional events I'd attended when Dr. Cross and I had gotten comfortable, maybe too comfortable. We'd started taking bigger risks, longer lunch breaks, more obvious displays of familiarity at work. less careful about hiding our text messages and private conversations. Some of our coworkers had started making jokes about how well we worked together, how we seemed to anticipate each other's moves, how we always seemed to end up on the same cases. "You two are like a married couple?" One of the other nurses said after watching us seamlessly coordinate care for a complex patient. We laughed it off, but I saw the look that passed between Dr. Cross and me, and I wondered if other people were starting to notice things we thought we were hiding. The night everything fell apart, I was supposed to be working a late shift. Instead, Dr. Cross and I had decided to grab dinner at this little place outside the city, somewhere we'd never been before, somewhere we thought we'd be safe from recognition. It was a perfect evening, great food, intimate conversation, the kind of connection that had been drawing me to him for months. We were holding hands across the table, talking about taking a weekend trip together, when I looked up and saw David standing in the doorway of the restaurant. For a second, I thought I was hallucinating. There was no way David would be at this random restaurant an hour outside the city on a Tuesday night. But he was there, and he was staring directly at me, and the expression on his face was unlike anything I'd ever seen from him before. Dr. Cross followed my gaze and immediately dropped my hand, but it was too late. David had seen everything he needed to see. I watched David turn and walk out without saying a word, without making a scene, without even acknowledging that he'd seen me. Somehow, that calm reaction was more terrifying than shouting would have been. "Why should you go after him?" Dr. Cross asked. I don't know, but I did know. I knew that David leaving quietly meant he wasn't acting on impulse or emotion. It meant he was thinking, planning, deciding what to do with the information he'd just gained. And that scared me more than immediate confrontation would have. I went home that night expecting to find David waiting for me, ready to have it out. Instead, the apartment was empty. His car wasn't in the parking lot. His work bag wasn't by the door. And there was no note explaining where he'd gone. I called and texted him repeatedly, getting no response. I tried to sleep but couldn't, replaying the moment he'd seen me with Dr. Cross, trying to figure out what he might be thinking, what he might be planning to do. He came home the next morning while I was getting ready for work, and his calmness was unsettling. "We need to talk," he said simply. "David, I can explain." No need to explain. I saw what I needed to see. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. David wasn't angry or emotional or accusatory. He was methodical, asking direct questions and listening to my answers without interruption. He wanted to know how long it had been going on, whether it was serious, whether I wanted to end our relationship. I tried every manipulation tactic I could think of. I cried. I apologized. I blamed the stress of work and the distance that had grown between us. I told him Dr. Cross meant nothing to me, that it was just a mistake, that I wanted to make our relationship work. Nothing landed. David listened to everything I said with the same calm detachment, like he was gathering information rather than processing betrayal. "Are you going to leave me?" I finally asked. "I haven't decided yet," he said, "but I think you've already made your choice." That afternoon, while I was at work, David did something I never would have expected from him. He went through my laptop, my phone records, my social media messages, and he documented everything. Screenshots of conversations with Dr. Cross, credit card receipts from restaurants and hotels, location data that contradicted the stories I told about where I'd been. He didn't just find evidence of the affair. He found evidence of where and when it had happened, including multiple incidents at the hospital during work hours. And then he did something that changed everything. He sent it all to hospital administration. I found out what David had done when my supervisor called me into her office the next morning. She had a folder on her desk that I recognized immediately. Printouts of text conversations between Dr. Cross and me, photos of us together that I didn't even know existed, documentation of times we'd been seen leaving work together, entering and exiting supply closets, taking extended breaks simultaneously. "We need to discuss some concerns about your professional conduct," she said, sliding the folder across the desk to me. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. David had been thorough, more thorough than I'd ever imagined he was capable of being. He'd documented everything with timestamps, locations, and context. He'd built a case that showed not just that Dr. Cross and I were having an affair, but that we'd been conducting it on hospital property, during work hours, in areas where patient care could have been compromised. "Where did you get this?" I asked, though I already knew the source isn't important. What's important is that these allegations represent serious violations of hospital policy regarding workplace relationships and professional conduct. I tried to explain, to minimize, to contextualize. I told them the relationship hadn't interfered with patient care. that we'd always maintained professionalism when it mattered, that this was being blown out of proportion by someone with personal motivations for causing trouble. But the evidence was overwhelming. There were photos of us in the supply closet where medications were stored. Text messages discussing meeting in areas where patient confidentiality could have been breached. Timestamps showing extended absences from our stations during busy periods. You're being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, my supervisor said. You'll need to surrender your badge and access cards immediately. Dr. Cross was called in for the same conversation an hour later. I saw him briefly in the hallway as security was escorting me out, and the look he gave me was pure panic. This wasn't just about our jobs. This was about our medical licenses, our professional reputations, our ability to work in healthcare anywhere. I drove home in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. David was there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with another folder in front of him. You destroyed my career, I said as soon as I walked in. You destroyed your career, he replied calmly. I just documented it. This is vindictive. This is cruel. You're trying to ruin my life over a personal issue. A personal issue. For the first time since this all started, I saw real emotion in his face. You conducted an affair at your workplace, during work hours, in areas where you're supposed to be providing patient care. That's not personal. That's professional misconduct. I wanted to argue with him, to tell him he was being dramatic and vindictive, but part of me knew he was right. Dr. Cross and I had taken risks that could have compromised patient safety. We'd been irresponsible, not just personally, but professionally. What do you want from me? I asked. Nothing, he said. I want nothing from you. He stood up and handed me the second folder. These are the papers I filed this morning. Divorce papers. I'm moving out this weekend. David, please, we can work through this. I'll end things with him. I'll do whatever it takes. It's too late for that. It's not too late. We can go to counseling. We can start over. And, his voice was firm but not unkind. Look at me. Really look at me. I looked at him, and for the first time in months, I actually saw him. I saw the hurt I'd caused, the betrayal he'd experienced, the way I'd undermined his trust and disrespected our relationship. But I also saw something else. Resolve, peace, even, I'm done, he said quietly. I'm done being lied to. I'm done being taken for granted. And I'm done pretending this relationship is worth saving. The investigation at the hospital moved quickly. Within a week, both Dr. Cross and I were terminated for violating workplace conduct policies. The hospital's legal team was concerned about liability issues. If our affair had compromised patient care in any way, they could face lawsuits and regulatory sanctions. My nursing license was suspended pending review by the state board. Dr. Cross faced the same scrutiny with his medical license. Word spread quickly through the medical community. Healthcare is a surprisingly small world, and scandals like this don't stay secret. I couldn't find another hospital job. Every application I submitted was met with requests for references from my previous employer, and the hospital's HR department was legally required to disclose the reasons for my termination. No healthcare facility wanted to hire someone with a documented history of professional misconduct. Dr. Cross disappeared from my life as quickly as he'd entered it. When I tried to contact him after we were both fired, he made it clear that he blamed me for the situation. He claimed I'd been reckless, that I'd pushed for more risks than he was comfortable with, that he'd tried to keep our relationship more discreet. It was bullshit. Of course, he'd been just as reckless as I had, just as willing to take chances, just as invested in the affair. But now that there were consequences, he was rewriting history to make himself the victim, and me, the reckless one who destroyed both our careers. I ended up taking a job in retail, the only work I could find that didn't require references from the hospital. The pay was less than half what I'd been making as a nurse, and the work felt meaningless after years of healthcare. David, meanwhile, seemed to thrive after our divorce. He got promoted at his company, started dating someone new, moved into a nice apartment across town. Mutual friends would update me on his life, always with this tone of surprise, like they hadn't expected him to bounce back so well. But why wouldn't he bounce back? He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd been loyal, trusting, supportive, and I'd repaid that with lies and betrayal. The fact that he was doing well just proved that our relationship had been holding him back, not lifting him up. It's been almost 2 years now since everything fell apart. I'm still working retail, still struggling to rebuild my professional reputation, still dealing with the consequences of choices I made when I thought I was being clever and careful. People expect me to express more regret than I feel. They expect me to take full responsibility, to admit that I was completely wrong, to show more remorse for the pain I caused David, but honestly, I'm mostly angry. I'm angry that David couldn't just handle our relationship problems like an adult instead of going scorched earth on my career. I'm angry that the hospital couldn't separate personal issues from professional performance. I'm angry that Dr. Cross threw me under the bus to save his own reputation. I'm angry that everyone expects me to be grateful for the learning experience of losing everything I'd worked for. Was I perfect? No. Did I make mistakes? Obviously, but the punishment didn't fit the crime. And I can't pretend to feel worse about it than I actually do. I miss the work. I miss the intensity, the purpose, the feeling that I was making a difference in people's lives. I miss the version of myself I was in the hospital. Competent, respected, essential, but I don't miss David. And I don't regret leaving him, even if I regret how it happened. We were never right for each other, and staying in that relationship would have been settling for both of us. Maybe that makes me a terrible person. Maybe I should feel more guilty, more sorry, more responsible for the chaos I caused. But I can't force feelings I don't have. And I'm tired of pretending to be more broken up about it than I actually am. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if David had just talked to me about our problems, instead of turning detective. Maybe we could have ended things honestly. Maybe I could have transitioned out of the relationship and into something new without destroying my career in the process. But that's not what happened. And I can't change it now. All I can do is figure out how to move forward from here, even if everyone else thinks I deserve to be stuck in this mess forever.